Hi, and welcome to the OrgDev podcast. So, organizational transformation is not a linear process or a technical project. It's a deeply human, emotional, and social experience. In times of change, people face loss, uncertainty, and shifts in how they see themselves. Yet, change management tools and approaches often reinforce the status quo or avoid the deeper issues. Today, we're joined by the extremely accomplished Andrew Day. His work challenges the idea that transformation can be planned and managed purely from the top, and instead he invites us to see change as a social and emotional process that must be worked with, not controlled. Andrew is an extremely experienced consultant, facilitator, and coach with over 25 years international experience, and he describes himself as a scholar practitioner bringing theory into practice and vice versa. Andrew helps leaders strategically design and develop their organization. Andrew is a psychologist by background. He's particularly focused on the influence of psychological, political, and group dynamics. And Andrew works across a wide range of public, private, and third sector organizations, including BP, GSK, the NHS, and the Civil Service, along with several UN agencies as well. Andrew previously worked at Ashridge Business School, where he led its organization development practice, and really interestingly, Ford Motor Company, where he managed its European organization development team as well. Now, Andrew has an impressive array of professional and academic qualifications. He's a chartered psychologist, holds a master and a doctorate in occupational psychology, and a second doctorate in counselling, psychology, and psychotherapy as well. He's taught on both the Ashridge Masters in Organisational Change and the Masters in Executive Coaching, and has published extensive research on coaching, leadership, and organisational change. And really importantly, and Danny and I have really enjoyed this book, he's the author of Disruption, Change, and Transformation in Organisations, a human relations perspective, and you'll see that Danny has absolutely devoured that book by judging by the bacon bookmarks that we can see. so welcome, Andrew. It's really lovely to have you join us.
Welcome. We're really excited to have you with us, and we very much, as Gary said, really enjoyed devouring your book. So just to kick us off, just tell us a bit more about the work that you do. What does your work involve?
Well, I'm primarily do external consulting across different sectors, different range of clients, pretty broad the work I'd say I do. I do a fair amount of one-to-one coaching, usually with senior leaders, work with senior teams, helping them primarily, I think in today's context, lead strategic change, lead some form of transformation, think about their leadership with a purpose. And then there's kind of more what I would call kind of systemic consulting, working with a large system, multiple interventions over time. I try to work with large groups in a participative way. That's not always the case, but trying to come alongside, an organization and help them work through a process of change or transformation.
Fabulous. And then about the book, kind of Disruption, Change, and Transformation in Organizations, what prompted you to write that? What was the driver behind that?
I think, as you said, I do quite a lot of writing about practice, and I might do a LinkedIn post, or I might do a blog, or it might be an article. But I think over a period of time, I started to see some themes that were emerging across my consulting work. I started writing it when I was at Ashridge Business School. There's quite a lot of conversation about what are we seeing in our clients, what's happening. I did a piece of work, a research with Kevin Power during the economic crisis. So Kevin was a colleague of mine. We worked together for 20 years, and we were trying to, in the midst of the kind of economic crisis, we were talking to our clients about, well, what are you experiencing? How are you trying to lead? What's happening? How are people responding? And some of that research and some of the writing I was doing started kind of making me think about, well, actually, there's not much written on the process of transformation and what that means from an organizational development perspective. And then writing is a process of inquiry, where I was trying to look at theory, trying to bring together cases of what I'd done, make sense of my experience. At the time, Ashridge was going through quite a lot of transformation, and disruption. And so there's quite a personal aspect to the book of where I found myself in an organization and what was happening to my identity, some of the emotions that I was experiencing, my colleagues, feelings of outrage, then trying to think about those feelings, thinking about I was leading a team through that process. I was consulting to organizations. And then I started looking back. I mean, one of the, earlier chapters in the book, I mean, I look back at what happened in the 10 years when I was at Ford of Europe and Ford Motor Company. And then I went back and I thought, I did my doctorate in Leamington Foundry, which was a component plant of Ford. And I thought, I wonder what happened with my research there, which was all about introducing autonomous work groups on the shop floor. And I found that now that is kind of major supermarket chain is on the site. I mean, they not only closed the plant, but they knocked the whole building down, and it's now a supermarket. And that symbolically, to me, seemed to represent this kind of social process, an organizational process that I think we're all engaged in grappling with. I guess, what's happening at the community there, what happened to those people that I worked with. I was working with them 20 years ago, helping them to survive. And it was very much positioned as, you've got to do this. If you don't transform in this way, you won't survive. Well, they didn't survive. And then I listed out all the Ford plants that were in the UK when I joined in 1994 or something like that. And then I listed out the ones that were still there. And it's quite shocking, really, just to see that how dramatic that change is. I think Ford has gone from something like one of the biggest employers in the UK. It's still a significant entity in the UK, but it's dramatically different than it was before. So I got kind of curious about, what do these processes mean emotionally, psychologically? What do they mean for the process of change? And kind of towards the end, it helps you make sense. Helping me make sense of some of the big kind of societal dynamics that we're starting to see, where I think you could trace some of the politics and the movement towards populism as a response to kind of uncertainty, anxiety, globalization, loss of identity, grief at a scale that's not processed, and therefore people are trying to hang on to the past, go back to the good old days. You can see that kind of language within the political discourse, what happened with Brexit and some of the US politics.
Your book was published, I think it was 2020, wasn't it? And you were talking then about that kind of exponential shift in the rate of change and instability and unpredictability. And probably you think about the 5 years since then, it's kind of accelerated, even more.
Yes, and I was thinking this morning, we're only really on the tip of it, because I I wrote about all these things I didn't really understand. And, this idea of the fourth industrial revolution, the Internet of Things, quantum computing, artificial intelligence, the growth in robotics, were all things, as I was researching the book, that people were talking about, and you could see the early signs of it. But we didn't have things like ChatGPT. We still haven't got quantum computing, or, I guess there's talk about, kind of rapid increase in processing size. I mean, I don't understand any of that as a psychologist, but I think you can, you almost what I started doing in the book was go back to previous, the Industrial Revolution itself, and to think about, well, what has history, taught us about how people kind of cope with these dynamics and this level of disruption.
And I think one of the things I noticed as I was reading, you said something around the kind of, one of the implications is organizations kind of in being able to adapt to that kind of continual change is having the capacity and the willingness to notice emerging trends. And there's a lot that gets in the way of people being willing to notice those trends. So it's almost like head down. Yes, we've got the capacity, but are we willing to actually engage with it and lean into what that might mean?
I think as OD professionals, we know an awful lot about those sorts of processes, those sorts of social processes. I mean, you've got all of the kind of psychoanalytic Tavistock tradition around kind of defenses, organizational defenses, social defenses. You've got Chris Argyris' work around defensive routines. So I think there's that angle to kind of adaptive capacity, is the kind of social processes, the kind of leadership that's required. And then I think there's a kind of another side to it, which also we can help with, which is, how do you design organizations such that they have more adaptive ability, flexibility, capacity for people to respond at a local level and be more networked as opposed to centralized control, which is quite hard for organizations to respond and nimbly and flexibly, as we all know, really.
Because transformation is one of those sort of terms that sort of entered the business dictionary, hasn't it? But it's such a broad term, isn't it? And it means so much to so many different organisations. In your experience, can you sort of, as a consultant out in the field, can you often sort of see a transformation and know from the very beginning whether it's going to thrive or potentially hit the buffers as it's being launched into an organisation?
Oh, so that's a hard one. I mean, the word itself, I mean, it is. You could really deconstruct it and say, well, it's, is it even a helpful word to use? But it is being used, and I think it gets used in very different ways. And you could think about different forms of transformation. I mean, I think one of the questions is, in my experience, you've got organisations that are trying to reactively respond and are in a reactive mode, and you've got other organisations that are a much more proactive, strategic mode. They're seeing an opportunity and a possibility and leaning into it rather than having to transform because they've somehow got too far behind the market, the competitors, what people want from the organization. And I think the former, the reactive group, find it much more difficult to transform. They tend to be in a more kind of defensive mode of engaging, of reacting, whereas the kind of, probably because there's more of a kind of sense of fear and survival that's around, whereas a more proactive approach to transformation, usually there's kind of some sense of energy and purpose. There's a vision around what we could become, or a kind of sense of purpose around why we're doing this.
And obviously in the introduction we talked about the fact in times of change people face loss and uncertainty and shifts in how they see themselves as well. Why is it that so many change initiatives don't necessarily pay attention to that when it clearly can have such a big impact on the potential outcomes?
Well, I think it's as simple as it's painful, and people find it hard, myself included, to engage with difficult emotions and talk about them and explore them. And I think one of the other kind of secondary effects is that one of the dominant defenses against loss, kind of manic, Melanie Klein talked about the manic defense against loss. Everyone gets very, very busy and focused on running around doing things, but the action itself is, rather than being a productive action of getting things done, it's more of an avoidant behavior that means that we can, rather than talk about what we're feeling and what's really going on, we'd much rather invest our energy in doing, but it's an avoidance of something. And so people are kind of skimming along at a kind of relatively superficial level rather than at a more of an emotional level, engaging with what is changing around them and how it's affecting them as individuals.
I was watching a video that you did. You're doing a presentation on some of the research you've done on top teams, and one of the things that you sort of talked about there is the fact that a lot of senior leaders sort of they have emotions, they have anxieties, but often they're suppressed or not discussed. Is that a sort of a common pattern that you see in top teams? And what are some of the things that you sort of
I think it would be somewhat unfair to pin it just on top teams. I think groups, you would say, groups of people find it hard to, under certain conditions, to talk about how they're actually feeling and what's going on for them. And in a way, someone, I think it was Gene Newman once said to me, Gene Newman of the Tavistock Institute, who, he said something to me along the lines of, you can explore and find all sorts of dynamics to process within a group or a team. We only really need to focus on those ones that are interfering with the primary task of the team or the group. So start first with the task and then think about how the emotional life of the group is interfering or hindering what the group is trying to do. And I think for a top team, that way of thinking is really helpful because, first of all, a lot of top teams are not that clear on what their primary task is. Finding their task and agreeing this is what we're trying to do is one thing, and then helping them think about, yes, and how are you doing that? A kind of more reflective kind of mode of operating, where they're kind of looking at how they're working together and what might be getting in the way of them performing their task. I find that very helpful and straightforward way of thinking about, about leadership teams and how to support them, as opposed to they've all got an emotional life and we've got to talk about all the emotions that are around. That's not realistic and it doesn't happen. But secondly, it doesn't tend to work in my experience.
It's super awkward for. And I guess, how do you create the conditions for people to talk about emotions, though? Because it's part of that is sort of showing vulnerability, isn't it, to a certain extent?
Yes. Well, someone asked me this the other day. They kind of said, it's one of these calls where you get them saying, like, this is highly confidential. We're looking for someone to work with our executive team. This is we're only talking to a small number of people. We want your opinion. And they told me a little bit about the brief of the context. And I said, well, it doesn't sound very safe. So somehow you have to find a way of helping this group feel safe enough that they're going to talk about, and they're going to be willing to talk about, something meaningful apart from playing out games with each other and pretending that everything's okay, or getting into a big fight with each other. So the setup, I say, well, I think the things I went back to them to say is, one, you've got to think of the setup. First and foremost, do they want to do work on themselves, on how they work? Big question. And if so, what would be that work? So what would be the contract? And then I think there's a piece of work with the leader of the team around, well, is there enough alignment congruence between what you think you want to work on with this team and what the team feels that it needs to work on? And then is there a kind of sense that the team wants my help? Is there a sense that they want to work with me in the way that I would work with them? And then I think it's, so there's quite a lot of kind of setup conditions. Where would we meet? Is it away from the office? Kind of Shine would call it a cultural island. We might think about it as a space away from the everyday work. And then can we find a way into the work that speaks to what they need? And that usually is some task or goal that they feel that they need to achieve, and that they feel some level of anxiety about, and that you can then find a way of working, helping them work together where they're going to feel that actually we're more likely that we can achieve that common aim. I think Marv Weisball, he made a point about focusing on the common ground and finding the common ground. And if we can find some common ground and we can find something everyone wants to collaborate on, then focus on helping them collaborate towards that goal, and then find where the dynamics might be getting in the way. And then I think there's a case, I tried to think about, well, how could we get into working on those dynamics in a way that isn't going to amplify the anxieties too much, so that people are going to avoid doing the work that they need to.
And if anyone's watching this, it's so easy to skip these steps, isn't it? There's so much pressure to go quickly, but you have to lay a strong foundation to create the conditions. And I really love what you're saying there in terms of making it safe enough. Like, you can't extend and guarantee safety, can you?
Well, I think the good thing is life teaches you lessons, doesn't it? And once I've had enough goes round the block where I've had clients say, oh, well, but we haven't got time to do all of that upfront stuff, and don't worry, it will be fine. And then me kind of going, all right, I'll take a punt on this, and then it not working at all. And then, you've always got to hold in mind when it doesn't, where does the blame go when something doesn't work out? Well, it goes towards the consultant. And I mean, in a certain sense, rightly so, because they're looking to you to hold them and to think through what works. And clients, I think you've always got to find within the work, there will always be an energy in the client system for change and for development. And there will also be an energy, which is a more defensive energy, for how can we get what we want without doing the work that we need to do with each other. And so at some level, you've got to hear the invitation into that kind of second dynamic, because we all, myself included, you want you want the outcomes, but you don't really want to go through the process to get you there sometimes. But it's the process that you have to go through.
Hi, we're just pausing this interview for a moment. Have you ever finished an episode of the OrgDev podcast and wish you had a cheat sheet that summarizes all of the key points? Us too, so we made one. It's called From Pod to Practice, and each week in our newsletter we'll share a 2-page summary of the latest OrgDev episode, and it includes key takeaways, a reflection prompt, and one small action you can try.
And it's all in a digital format with space at the end to add your own notes and reflections, and it's designed to help you take the learning from the podcast into your day-to-day work. So to get your copy, just sign up to our Next Step to Better newsletter. The link's in the show notes, or you can visit our website at www.distinction.live to get the latest From Pod to Practice in your inbox. And let us know what you think. We'd love to get your feedback. So one question we always like to ask people is how did you end up working in OD? What was your unique journey here?
I was really lucky. I was doing psychology at Newcastle University, and even in my second year, I had some conversations about changing the course because I couldn't see the applied element. I mean, I look back on my younger self and thought, oh, you really missed an opportunity there. But at the time, I thought I wanted something a bit more applied. And I at the time, undergraduate psychology was a bit academic and quite statistical and very cognitive. And then in the final year, I hung on in there. And then the final year was the first year they did organizational psychology as a major subject in the final year. And I liked the sound of it and I loved it. I finished university not knowing what I wanted to do and went traveling. And then I thought, oh, that's what I really enjoyed. I really enjoyed that aspect of my degree. I wonder if I can do a master's in it. Again, I was quite lucky because I got in, that's kind of patterned my career, getting in just at the last minute to do a master's in occupational psychology. And then I did some work with a small company, a small consultancy, and somehow I applied for a job and it wasn't clear that this job was with Ford. Ford was very cyclical, had a big internal occupational organizational psychology department. With the downturn, they'd scaled it back and they were looking for someone not as senior who could just keep it ticking along. And I was kind of thrown in at the deep end, had a lot of responsibility, stretched beyond what I could really do at the time, somehow survived. And more, then I kind of kept going back to, what I'm really interested in is large systems, organizational development. And again, I was lucky because Ford has a massive, amazing history being at the forefront of OD thinking. I mean, within the US, Miller Tyson had done lots of work on large systems. I mean, I got introduced into some work in one of the subsystems of Ford where Peter Senge had basically done a lot of his work that led to the fifth discipline and all of those models and frameworks and so on and so forth. And you were exposed, not only were you exposed to the latest thinking, they were doing it and they were up for experimentation. I mean, it's a side of Ford, I think, that doesn't always get external coverage, but really fortunate. I mean, this is 25 years ago, 25 years ago. A lot of work on diversity, equality, inclusion. Again, I think that was because it was a US business, first and foremost. But I found myself, after I left Ford, going into consulting to businesses. And I was quite amazed at how far behind the curve many organizations were in terms of thinking about, just basic, equality, good practices. So all of these things you kind of got given. It was great opportunity to do really interesting things. And the good thing with Ford as well is that if you showed that you could do something, then people would trust you and you'd be thrown in to get on with it. And then I was, went on to work with Ashridge, which was again fantastic. It's a very autonomous culture, very experimental. So long as you met your targets and no one complained about you, or clients didn't complain too much, you could do what you wanted, where you wanted, how you wanted, and it's kind of wonderfully kind of experimental place, really. That
And when you were at Ashridge, what kind of things did you get involved in? What kind of things were sort of taking your attention?
well, I mean, I did a lot of different things, really. I did quite a bit of teaching towards the end. So on the Ashridge Masters in Organisational Consulting, the Coaching Masters with Eric DeHaan, Charlotte Sills, and many others. Then I always had a bit of a sideline on research and writing, just to gain all the things that I was interested in, and a good bit of consulting work. You couldn't do too much doing the other things, but a bit of executive education, a bit of work with executive teams, some coaching, and occasionally a kind of interesting OD project.
You also did a doctorate in, is it psychotherapy as well? How did that sort of gather your attention? And what was the draw to that? Because again, that's really looking beneath the surface of an organisation, isn't it?
Well, I did. The Tavistock Institute had an advanced organisational consulting program, and that had introduced me to the systems psychodynamics paradigm. I mean, I always explain to people that my experience of that program is I saw the world in black and white, and all of a sudden I saw the world through colour. And once you've seen the world in colour, you can't go back to seeing it in black and white. And through that process, it opened up, invited me to do quite a lot of work on myself, a big psychotherapeutic influence through metanoia, people like Charlotte Sills, who has a very strong she's a psychotherapist, writes a huge amount in the field. And then Bill Critchley at Ashridge was a Gestalt psychologist. Eric DeHaan's very influenced by, kind of different bodies of psychotherapy. And I thought I needed to do a bit more work on myself. And I was just really interested in it. I was really interested in Freud, Kleinian, psychoanalysis, Rogerian I'm quite intricative in my approach. So I looking at different theories and different ways of understanding things. So it added a kind of a depth to my practice.
And what were some of the biggest sort of breakthrough moments? You said you started to see the world in colour. What were some of the moments when you started to perceive organisations, identity groups, whatever, in a different way?
It's very, very hard to, once you've learned something and gone through the process over many years, to go back to how you used to look at things. But it almost a bit more of a questioning attitude of, well, someone might say, well, that wasn't a good meeting, or they didn't behave very well, or these are the bad people over here. And rather than kind of taking that quite literally, one would think, well, that's an interesting construction that these people are bad. Well, what might be meant by that? And if these people, who are these people, and who are the other people who are thinking this, and what might be going on in the context that has led to, some form of splitting between good and bad, who's splitting between whom? Well, what might be going on at a level that's not being spoken about, kind of anxieties or fears that mean that people have to regress into splitting things into good and bad. And once you start to see that type of process, it's all over the place within organizations. And I don't know. I mean, maybe the process of learning was at some level seeing organizations as kind of primarily rational and logical places, to actually realizing they're just completely bonkers. And
maybe that should be the tagline for our podcast.
The madness or the kind of craziness of organizational life, and that you're kind of running around. I mean, at some point, I think I kind of found myself kind of running around trying to find explanations for things. But if you're trying to find logical explanations, things, or logical ways forward, but actually it's all a bit madness, you're kind of working in the wrong domain, aren't you?
So just a quick follow-up question to that then. So how do you stay on solid ground? Because that is very easy to get sort of taken along into the organization, isn't it? And people often post-rationalize very emotional decisions and make them appear quite logical, don't they? So how do you sort of stay on solid ground?
Excellent question. I mean, for risk of sounding like a textbook, I think one is the more that you know yourself, who you are, where your boundaries are, what you believe in, where your values are, what you're seeing, what you are seeing, and what other people are seeing, and what you're feeling, and other people. The more you're clear on that, the more that you can see where you might be pulled along. And, one thing I learned in my psychotherapy training is you've got to be the good thing with psychotherapy is there's very clear role boundaries and roles. And then you can notice when you're pulled out of role. Whereas in consulting work, you if you're not clear on your role and your role hasn't been agreed and you're not clear in your own mind, it's very hard to see where you've been pulled out of role. So that's another guiding principle for me. I think good supervision, regular supervision. And if you haven't got, you can't talk to someone immediately, kind of talking to a peer, there's people I know that I would phone up and say, can I just run this through you? This doesn't feel right. And I think trusting your intuition. I mean, I think I've learned over the years, if something doesn't feel right, if you don't feel that you're doing something that you actually believe in, but you're being pulled along, then just trust your intuition and try to find and reflect on what is going on. And even if you can't work out what's going on, something is going on, you just can't see it yet. And then I think the kind of final thing is just a discipline of reflective practice, of constantly coming back and questioning, what am I seeing? What am I trying to do? What am I feeling? Did that work? Did not? And trust that that process at least keeps you honest with yourself.
And then obviously there's a lot of people that watch this podcast that are internal, and I've heard lots of stories, really positive stories about the work that you've done in the civil service, for example, about people feeling resourced. How do you help people feel? Because it's hard, isn't it? You're sitting within a hierarchy. There's lots of demands on you. You're pulled in different directions. At least with a consultant, there's a little bit of distance that they can sort of pull a bit.
Kind of Sophie Pern, who I don't know, you're going to talk to Sophie in the coming months. We wrote a piece based on a piece of research, because we noticed that in the larger pieces of work we did, there was always an internal group, an internal consultant that we are partnering with, and then you end up with these triangular dynamics of client, internal, external. And if you're not clear on your roles, on the contracts of how you're going to work together, you're going to get poured in all sorts of messes. And I think the OD axiom of, what you're trying to do is build the system's capability to solve problems for itself, to adapt for itself, to learn for itself. So you're trying to make yourself redundant. If you're honest to that value and that principle, then you need to find who the internals are. You might not know who they are. Try to contract with them and build a relationship, and recognize that you need to be working in some form of partnership that builds their relationship with the client, and that you're not undermining the internals to build up your position. But equally, sometimes it creates quite tricky, kind of territorial difficulties between the internals and the externals. If you're not careful, you end up competing with each other for the relationship with the client, and I think you just got to be really mindful of where your own anxiety as an external consultant might pull you into those types of dynamics. I think the other thing that helps me is having been an internal. And when we were writing, Sophie and I were writing this piece, I was going back and reflecting on some of my, how I behave sometimes as an internal. And it wasn't always, it's not always moments that I look back on with pride. There were sometimes, we'd have the large consultancies in, and I'd be like, oh, hang on a second, what are you doing here? What I thought I was here to help here, and suddenly you appear, and your own kind of envy of like, oh, how much are you getting paid for all of this work? And what does this say about me? That and somehow, as an external, now being on an external, one has to have some empathy and some understanding for what it's like to be an internal. And I think, how can you recognize what each party has to bring? Because as an external, you very rarely really understand the politics of the organisation, what's been done before, the characters you're working with.
I think it's really challenging, isn't it, as an internal as well, to have an external say the same thing you've said or tried to say.
Yeah,
That's so true.
yeah. And sometimes you kind of feel a bit guilty because you can see that dynamic at play, really.
Yeah.
But
so going back, I was just struck as you were talking about that kind of seeing the world in black and white and then seeing it in a rainbow. You can't go back from that. Often when we're working with clients, they like the black and white. They like the make it black and white and make it simple. And I was struck by some of the things you said in your book about you can't have transformation without disruption and change is messy. And kind of if we lean into that human relations on the side of change and transformation, how do we get people to kind of accept the messiness and lean into that?
Well, maybe there's a bit of a clue in your question, because how do we get people? I think we can't get people to do things. We can in a sense create a space where there's an invitation for people to step in. I think Shine's process consulting is there's a number of works that I just think are just brilliant and insightful, and I think his whole frame of a helping relationship and what characterizes a helping relationship, and if we can try to do that and then meet people where they are. And I think my own being in therapy and having worked with people in therapy gives you a kind of realistic kind of understanding of the speed with which people can kind of process deep change and what's realistic and what's possible. And, you get to, hopefully you get to see a bit more of your own defensive process, so you can understand other people's defensive process when it's in there, and kind of watch out for, the moment when you think someone should be doing something or they're not doing it right, or you start having kind of critical feelings of your client or othering them, or they don't do this, or you find yourself complaining to your colleagues about the client. These are all clues for saying somehow you've fallen out of relationship and connection. And usually behind that is some projection or something you're not really able to face up to in yourself, really.
That's so important, though, isn't it? Oh, so important, isn't it? But it happens so naturally, isn't it? It's like, because again, it goes back to sense making, isn't it? It's just like, you just want to have a bit of a moan or a little bit of steam off. But in there, in the detail, are all the clues, aren't they, that show what's really going on?
Yeah. I mean, I think as well, I mean, I think we can get hooked on, or I can get hooked on, you've got a client that's paying you, which in the grand scheme of the world is a lot of money to help them to do something. And they've got some expectations around that. And you can get caught up in your own worries about not living up to expectations, not being good enough, being criticized. And those are the sorts of things I think that quite understandably kind of throw you off balance a little bit. But I can, at the heart, once you've gone through and you've done some difficult work with enough clients, you know the position that you need to take up and inhabit for yourself, which will contain and hold people that will, that helps them through a process, I think.
Question I wanted to ask you, again, it was something you said in the book. You talked about technological exploitation very often not achieving its full potential because it's disrupting the social system and alienating people. And I was struck when I was reading about AI. That's, how do we fully exploit AI and bring people along on the journey rather than people feeling afraid by it and scared by it and kind of not leaning into it?
About 6 or 7 years ago, my wife and I went to, we were in Washington and we were looking at the different museums. There's fantastic museums in Washington. And there was a photograph, I think it was a photograph or a picture, and it was the first iron bridge that had been built in, I think it was just below what's now New York. And this iron bridge got burnt down. I don't know how you burn down an iron bridge. And it got burnt down by the ferrymen who had the boats that would take people and their whole livelihood and kind of income was based on ferrying people from one side of the river to the other. And of course, this iron bridge, basically ended there. I mean, presumably, if not all, a very large chunk of their income, put it to threat. And so one can I think that's the level of challenge that we face and that organizations face, is that we're going to suddenly have professions that are going to start to feel like the ferryman. And what's this going to do with my profession? What's my role now? It quite a kind of existential threat, really. And yet at the same time, AI is just, it's just amazing in terms of the kind of technological leap from where we were to. I was I was joking with some friends. I've got this reoccurring dream that I have, and I thought, I'll put it in ChatGPT just to see what ChatGPT says. And I said, can you give me a Freudian interpretation of this dream? I was quite taken back, something that would have taken me. I'm not saying that the interpretations were correct, because it was based on, half a page of notes. But it made me think. And then I say, can you give me a Kleinian interpretation? Can you give me a Lacanian interpretation? And can you give me, and not only did what it come back with was a perspective on the differences on the theory quickly, but what it said was, I'm pretty familiar with the literature, and I know, it's just unfathomable. So I did at one point. I said, how's AI going to threaten me? Then we caught up with some old friends of ours, and I haven't seen them for 6-7 years. He's a social researcher, does large social research projects in a European institution. They get funding from the EU. They do large data sets on social opinions across Europe on topics that are of interest for the EU or different governments. And then he told me about how they've started using, over the last 3 or 4 years, AI to do their analysis and their, all the analytical work for these big data sets. This is, in the space of what would have taken us months or years to do, instantaneously, you've got this data. We had the conversation about what that would enable him to do, how it changed his role. But also I kind of said, well, a bit of me felt a sense of loss and I remember all those hours I put into doing my doctorate to learn these analytical research methods, those hours sitting coding pieces of paper for my doctorate, writing it all up, and then going back and saturating myself in the data and listening to tapes again. And you could probably put it in ChatGPT now, and and get probably something of an equal, if not better, level of quality out of it at the end of the day. It's hard to comprehend.
So how do you equip a leader that is about to embark their team on an AI journey, because again, a lot of that is starting to happen now, isn't it? Where they're starting to say, look, automate your processes, and there's different levels of intervention, aren't there? There's sort of people just in their own individual role, but there's a sort of a bigger perspective. How can you do it where it becomes less ferryman and more partnership, and where people actually actively engage in it?
Well, I think what you just said, I think this thing about partnership and paying attention to, in the kind of Tavistock tradition, the social technical system, not just the technical system. And I think as an organizational, kind of perspective, there's a kind of ethical responsibility. Sometimes I think many organizations do think at an ethical level about the consequences and how can they support people. But I think there's an economic aspect to that. If people see that you genuinely don't really care and you're not considering the impact on them, then they're going to feel like the ferryman, and they're going to resist and try to subvert what's happening. It's a big question. I think as well. I think I would go back to principles of kind of action research, trying to think, I understand how to do this and what you need to do up front. Is probably not the case. But saying, okay, well, let's go work in cycles of, let's work out what it is we're trying to achieve. Let's gather some data. It doesn't have to be really comprehensive data. That's made easier, ironically, through AI. Kind of to look at that data with people, and with the right people, and to involve people in, it's kind of Lewinian idea of involving people in looking at, well, how the system is changing and what actions can be taken.
So just switching gears a little bit, what do you enjoy most about the work that you do? What really sparks joy? Makes you think this is a good.
First of all, I mean, if you go back to what I was saying earlier about not knowing what I wanted to do as an undergraduate, I mean, I'm fortunate. I found something that I just love. I mean, I do this as a hobby. I can't see myself, kind of retiring, partly because I enjoy the work. I enjoy the kind of depth of thinking that one is never really sure what's going on, and if things aren't black and white, they're always shades of grey, and there's that level. And then it brings you into. I mean, we get the opportunity to work with all of these different sectors in different countries with people from different, kind of cultural backgrounds. You get to hear about their lives. It helps you think about the bigger context that we're all working in. You learn about really interesting things, from like how the civil service works to how the NHS works to these large global corporations. Yeah, I mean, I guess it's an exercise in learning, and I feel challenged every day. I mean, every day you kind of think, well, how am I going to do this, or what do I need to do today? It's not like.
And on the flip side, like you said about challenge, what do you find most challenging about the role? What is it you find quite hard?
I mean, it's probably a bit the emotional side. I mean, if you're doing good work, you've got to be in it with the client enough to be able to empathize and connect. You've got to be outside of it enough that you let them own the problem and it's not yours. But that judgment is not always easy to make. Being an external, there's always the question of, kind of ongoing insecurity. Whereas, I might be busy now, but in a certain sense, the week before lockdown in the UK, I was fairly busy, and then within the space of a week, every client I had wrote to me and said, "Sorry, we can't continue this." I mean, it ended up being a good year, but in a certain sense, that for me was a bit like, one feels that there was a certain, I hark back to the days of. I mean, I think it's a false security, by the way, but I felt more secure in Ford because it's this huge, great big organization. But of course, someone in the US could have said, "Oh, we're going to have a reorganization and we're going to, but I find that aspect, kind of preoccupies me at times.
And then when you look back at your career so far, what are a couple of the biggest lessons that you've learned that you'd share with others?
Oh, lessons. Well, as I was saying before, hard lesson learned, trust your intuition. If something doesn't feel right, and then you've reflected on it and you've thought about it and it still doesn't feel right, then trust that. And all the times I haven't trusted it, I've regretted it. I mean, I think most times I haven't trusted my intuition, I've regretted it. That's a lesson. I think there's something about power in organizations. I mean, I did a case study. I was involved in quite a big internal consulting project, Ford, and I wrote a case study for the Tavistock program that I did. And whilst I was in the system doing the work, I was not fully appreciate. I mean, I must have been aware and cognizant of the power dynamics. But it was only when I wrote it up that I realised that in the way that we'd done the work, we basically mirrored and followed the existing power dynamics within the organisation, and that I found a bit shocking, really, because it wasn't something consciously that I did. But I'd been there 10 years, and at some point it triggered me to think, well, actually, it probably is a good time to leave, because if you're replicating the power dynamics and you're not aware that you are, maybe you've become too socialized and you can't quite see with the same clarity. So there's probably kind of that theme of you never fully can see or appreciate the dynamics that you're participating in. And I think, and at some point it will reveal itself if you care to look. And I think that probably is a good lesson for all of us in consulting, but in life in general, is that we always think that we sit outside of these dynamics and we're consciously aware of what we're doing and how we're interacting. Well, we're not. We're always somehow, participating in the very thing that we're trying to change, or that we might not quite see it. And that's fair. We shouldn't be too hard on ourselves in that regard, because I think that's just human nature. But it's quite a useful thing if you can catch as a consultant, because then you gives you an insight in terms of some patterns that perhaps you and others can't see.
Because often you're only seeing part of the pattern, aren't you? That's always the challenge. And I guess it's that power of reflection in the moment. So it's not a case of waiting for months later where it all becomes really clear. Like, how can you sort of do it in more real time is always the challenge, isn't it?
I think so. Yeah, that's a good, I guess, you can't, there is no such thing as a system. You can never see the system. You can fool yourself that you can stand outside the system and see it. We're always part of it and participating in these patterns. I think the kind of Stacey's ideas of complex responsive processes and kind of acting, kind of reflexivity are very helpful, and think about those sorts of processes.
How does a person with 2 doctorates invest in their own learning and development? Like, what else is there to learn? How do you stay sharp still?
Well, I think the kind of realities are, I got at the end of my first doctorate, I suddenly got interested in unconscious processes in organizations, because some weird stuff happened where all the things that, almost overnight, everything completely reversed itself because of 1 or 2 decisions that revealed a whole lot of stuff that was happening, which I hadn't fully picked up on. So I ended the process thinking that actually what I'd learned is how little I knew and had picked up on. And that's probably where I got to with my psychotherapy training, and that, in a sense, is a bit of the dichotomy. I mean, I don't think it wasn't me that said it. I think it was Plato that said that learning is a process of realizing how what you don't know rather than what you do know, which is a bit of a paradox, because I think clients often employ you because they think that you know something. And really what you're taking them on is a process to step into what they don't know and that you don't know, but to accompanying them through that in a creative way so that they can, discover something new.
And if anyone knows how to put that in a compelling proposal.
Yeah. Well, as you can see, I can't put anything in a kind of clear out inside way.
I think we're terrified a lot of clients, but it is about that getting to learn. You've got to learn to work. The client has to learn to work with you, and vice versa, don't they? And that kind of moving away from the not knowing, the kind of like the modernist way of, and the certainty as well is quite a paradigm shift, isn't it, for a lot of people that you're working with?
Yeah, I mean, coming back to some of your earlier questions, I think the bigger challenge that I have as a professional is to how you got to show up in an ordinary way. You've got to use ordinary language. You can't use the technical language, and you've got to meet people where they are. And all of the stuff that we're talking about, you've got to leave at the door and show up as a person and be helpful and trust that you can help people without, being, kind of falling into some kind of technical expert that somehow got the answers.
We'd obviously recommend people read your book, but is there another book or a resource that you'd recommend or you particularly like?
I really like this book. I mean, you'd probably come across it. It's pretty, can you see that? Paul Vaslovic, Change, Principles of Problem Formation and Problem Resolution. I mean, people who don't know Vaslovic, he worked a lot with Gregory Bateson, and with Gregory Bateson was really at the forefront of thinking about family systems therapy. And it's a really great, simple book that talks about the basic principle of how the solution ends up being the problem in lots of systemic, intractable problems, and how this whole idea of paradigm shifts, of how we get to the limits of a paradigm, and then we try to do more and more of the same, which produces more and more of the same. And it's a wonderful book, more through giving really simple, straightforward examples of stuck patterns of how they can be unstuck. So in a way, if you could read that book and you could understand it and you could apply it, and I don't think you really need to know much more really about organisations are like.
Brilliant. Well, there's a different book going on. Yes, so that's on our reading list. Brilliant. And one of the original missions of the podcast is to inspire the next generation of
Yes.
organization development people. So whether they're internal, whether they're thinking there must be another way, or they're just at the beginning of their OD career, what advice would you give them?
I think the first advice is follow your passions, follow what you believe in, what you enjoy. Always try to stretch yourself. I mean, look for, what's the adjacent space, what you're doing. Find great people that you can learn from. I mean, I kind of look back on my career, either you read their books or you find an opportunity to work with them. And yeah, look for opportunities. I kind of thought, I think having run a master's with people, sometimes people, sometimes you feel, well, I'm not doing that, or I don't have the chance to do that. But the great thing in organizational life is there's lots of opportunities that you can find, and not try and convince. I think the difficulty with OD is telling people up front what it is and trying to communicate something in a kind of rational, logical way. The best way I found was to find people that you could help and do something helpful with them. And then people will say things like, I don't know what you did there, but that meeting was completely different from the meeting we would usually have. And it was really helpful. And then lo and behold, people phone you up again and then start giving you referrals. And you do that enough, you suddenly find yourself working on some really, really interesting things and opportunities.
I think that's so important, isn't it? We get contacted a lot by people going, oh, how do I get started? But an organization is a laboratory, isn't there? There's just so many different places to practice, opportunities to find, and changes everywhere, isn't it? There's always a place to cut your teeth and learn, no matter where you are in an organization.
I mean, I would, yeah, and networking, I would add. I mean, I think I kind of try to think of networking as, in my experience, if you're just meeting with people that are interesting, and everyone is interesting, possibilities and opportunities always arise from conversation. And it's a bit like us talking now. If you talk if you genuinely meet people with a level of curiosity and wanting to learn and understand them and see the world as they're seeing it, then things happen. And I think that acting into the world with that intent is very, very helpful.
Brilliant. Well, Andrew, I want to say a huge thank you. I could literally keep this conversation going all day. I don't know about you, Danny. I really enjoyed it. There are so many questions I want to still ask as well. So it's been really, really useful. Danny, what for you are we going to take away from the conversation?
A treasure trove of things to take away. I think some of the things that struck me with when you talked earlier about the focusing on the primary task of the team, or whatever you're working on, that look at what are getting in the way. I think you shared some really powerful questions to kind of ask at the kind of upfront, like contracting, when you're contracting for a piece of work, and then the discipline of reflective practice and how important it is as practitioners to just really build that into the way we work.
Brilliant. Yeah, and I echo all those things. That's, you really reiterating the point of the importance of building a strong foundation to create the right conditions. And no matter how seductive it is to skip a step, just remembering what the eventual outcome will be if you don't do it as well. The importance about how you sort of create a safe enough environment to do the work, to allow people to do it. I really liked what you saying, your approach around how managers and teams can approach AI in a slightly different way by taking an action research approach as well. And I think one of the things I've just really enjoyed about the conversation is just you put a really refreshing honesty to it, which is the lessons we learn along the way, which I think is really important. And I think it's really important that as consultants and as internal practitioners we share that as well. And also just the millions of book references you've got. I've got about 6 out of here, Danny. I don't know how you've got. Yeah. So I think it's really, really useful. Andrew, if people want to reach out to you and follow your work, you do brilliant stuff on LinkedIn, for example. What's the best way to? And obviously we'll share all of this in the show notes.
Yeah, well, just drop me an email, drop me a message on LinkedIn. Always great to hear from people in the field, up for conversations. I think this, this idea of networks, a kind of field of professionals. I saw, there's a kind of, I feel that there's a European network of OD professionals that are, hopefully increasingly connected, and I really value that. So always up for talking to people.
Danny, give the book a quick wave because it was that good. We do really recommend people to read this book as well. That will be in the show notes as well. It's a really good read, and it's it's a very accessible read as well. So for those of you watching it that you've really enjoyed it and you think I know somebody that would really benefit from listening to Andrew's insights, then please do share the podcast. We get so many shares every week from people. So what's really nice. So if you know someone who's maybe struggling or just taking the steps in their career, then please share it with them, and also hit the like button and subscribe as well. We're growing the audience all of the time. Danny, how many countries are we in now?
76, I think.
76 countries, which is great. We're big in India and we're big in Germany now, so which is great. And that just shows how wonderful it is that the OD community is really growing as well. But most importantly, we just want to say a huge thank you, Andrew. You've been really generous with your time and your insights and your expertise. We've really enjoyed it, and I'm sure our audience will enjoy it. So thank you so much.
And thank you to both of you. Likewise, very generous, and I've really appreciated the interest in my work and the questions and where we've gone in the conversation.